Imagine being 5 years old, tucked into bed, drifting into the kind of deep, innocent sleep only a child can truly know. And when the morning comes, you are simply gone. No broken window, no shattered lock, no desperate cry piercing the night, just absence, silence, and a mystery so dark that even hardened investigators would call it one of the most terrifying cases they had ever encountered. This isn't a story from a novel or a thriller on Netflix. It's real. And it happened in a tiny Florida town that looked ordinary enough to the outside world. But behind its stillness brewed secrets, addictions, and violence that would set the stage for tragedy. And if there's one lesson we can already glimpse before diving in, it's this. Danger doesn't always come from the shadows outside your home. Sometimes it grows quietly within the very walls meant to keep you safe. The case of 5-year-old Haleigh Cummings is not only about a missing child. It's about cycles of neglect, poor decisions, and a family environment where chaos became normal. To really understand why this disappearance rattled people to their core, you have to see the landscape it unfolded in. Satsuma, Florida, wasn't the glamorous beach and surf version of the state we see in travel ads. It was the Florida of dense oak forests, swamps that breathed with mosquitoes, and rivers so slow and dark they seemed to swallow secrets whole. This was the kind of place where everybody knows everybody sounds comforting on the surface, but also means secrets fester behind closed doors because nobody wants to admit what they see. And in that hush of small-town life, a little girl's vanishing would expose fractures in a family already weighed down by addiction, violence, and generational dysfunction. Haleigh's story begins long before that February night in 2009. She was born with Turner syndrome, a condition requiring constant medical oversight, meaning her parents needed to be vigilant and proactive. But instead of finding stability in their home, Haleigh grew up with a father and mother locked in a storm of conflict. Ronald, the father, and Crystal, the mother, were young, mismatched, and ill-prepared. Their relationship was steeped in volatility. Crystal was only 17 when she gave birth to Haleigh, and their time together was marred by drugs, violence, and instability. What's striking here, when we step back, is how society often places children like Haleigh in the crossfire of adult choices. Think about this. At an age when most kids are surrounded by bedtime stories and playground adventures, she was navigating a world where custody battles, medical neglect, and alleged domestic abuse defined her reality. And it's not just about these two parents being unfit. It's about a system that weighed pay stubs and health insurance, paperwork more heavily than allegations of abuse. Ronald won custody largely because he had a low-paying but steady job with benefits, while Crystal was unemployed and battling her own demons. That decision may have seemed practical on paper, but in hindsight, it feels almost chilling, as though the state handed Haleigh from one storm into another, choosing stability of income over stability of safety. This early chapter of her life matters because it frames the disappearance not as a sudden lightning strike, but as the tragic crescendo of years of instability. The community may have seen a father trying to provide, but behind the walls of that trailer, the chaos was building. And in true crime, this is often the most unsettling truth. Tragedies rarely begin on the night. They explode into the news cycle. They begin years earlier, quietly, in patterns ignored until it's too late. February 9th, 2009, should have been just another night in a small Florida town. The kind of night where the only sounds are cicadas in the distance and the low hum of a TV set in a trailer park. But by dawn, it would be a night forever etched into headlines. A night people still whisper about in hushed tones, because it began as ordinary and ended as a nightmare. Ronald Cummings left his home that evening for a night shift at the steel plant. To him, it must have seemed like a simple trade-off. Go to work, earn money, trust that his 17-year-old girlfriend, Misty Croslin, could manage the kids for a few hours. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Decisions that feel simple in the moment can carry consequences no one imagines. And leaving two small children with a teenager who had already shown signs of instability was not just risky, it was reckless. Misty wasn't a babysitter plucked from a responsible family down the street. She was a high school dropout, known to run away from home, experiment with drugs, and live on impulse. In other words, she was still a child herself. Ronald was 25. That age gap might not raise eyebrows if she were in her 20s. But at 17, the difference wasn't just numerical. It was psychological, developmental, and emotional. To place two vulnerable children in her care, one of whom had complex medical needs, was a gamble at best, negligence at worst. That night, the house saw a parade of visitors. A repairman stopped by. Then Ronald's grandmother Annette brought clothes. Then Misty's brother Tommy came over. If you think about it, this already complicates the story. How many people came and went from that trailer in just a few short hours? This isn't the image of a quiet family night-in. It's the image of a chaotic household with too many moving parts. And chaos is the perfect camouflage for disaster. According to Misty, the kids ate hamburgers, watched movies like Air Bud and Madagascar, and were tucked into bed by around 8:15 p.m. But here's where skepticism has to kick in. Misty's accounts of that night would later change so many times that it's hard to know which version, if any, was true. Was Haleigh asleep beside her in the bed? Or in her own toddler bed? Was the house locked tight, or was the back door propped open with a cinder block? Did she wake up because she had to use the bathroom, or because she needed a drink of water? Each retelling reshuffled the details, like a deck of cards stacked against her credibility. And then came the moment that still sends chills. Sometime around 3 a.m., Misty claims she woke up, saw the kitchen light on, noticed the door open, and realized Haleigh was gone. Gone, without a trace, without a scream, without a struggle. The sheer terror of that realization is something few of us can truly comprehend. Think about it. One moment your child is asleep, her small breath steady in the dark, and the next moment the bed is empty, the air feels hollow, and silence screams louder than any alarm. When Ronald came home minutes later, what unfolded was raw, unfiltered desperation. The 911 call captures it all: his rage, his threats, his refusal to trust the police, and Misty's panicked attempt to explain. At one point, Ronald shouted that if he found the person responsible first, he didn't care if he spent the rest of his life in prison. That wasn't just anger. It was the primal howl of a parent who realizes the world is shattered in the most unimaginable way. But hidden beneath his rage is another unsettling thought. Was it really the work of a mysterious intruder? Or was this tragedy born inside the home itself? And that question, the stranger danger versus insider betrayal, is the axis on which this entire case turns. Ronald's 3-year-old son, Junior, gave police a detail too chilling to ignore. He said a man dressed in black came into the room and took his sister. Now, on one hand, This could be a child's dream confused with reality. But on the other hand, what if it wasn't? What if that fragment of memory is the closest thing to truth we'll ever get? Investigators searched with dogs, helicopters, and dive teams, but found nothing. The swampy woods and rivers around Satsuma swallowed every hope, leaving behind only questions. And here's the part that truly unsettles people. Cases like this remind us that when children vanish, it's not always in crowded malls or city parks. Sometimes they disappear from the very place meant to be safest, their own bed. The first patrol cars arrived just after 3 a.m., their flashing lights cutting through the dark stillness of rural Florida. What they found wasn't a calm household reporting a missing child. It was chaos. Ronald was outside, wild with rage and grief, punching walls and cars until his knuckles bled, screaming at Misty as though she alone held the answers. The deputies tried to get control, but the scene told its own story. This was not the calculated panic of strangers staging an abduction. It was raw dysfunction exploding in front of uniformed officers. From the very start, investigators faced an impossible puzzle. Haleigh wasn't the kind of child to wander off. Ronald insisted she couldn't even open the deadbolt by herself. And yet she was gone, vanished into the night. Was it a predator who slipped in silently? Or someone inside that home who knew the cracks in its fragile walls? The only witness was 3-year-old Junior, and his claim about a man in black haunted detectives. Was this the vivid imagination of a toddler processing fear, or the single clue to what really happened? With no physical evidence, no forced entry, and no signs of struggle, police had to chase both possibilities, and both would lead them down paths that twisted back toward the family itself. By morning, the search effort was massive. Dogs tracked the nearby woods. Dive teams combed the St. Johns River. Helicopters scanned from above. Neighbors were woken up by knocks at their doors, asked to check sheds and backyards. But what made the investigation even more complicated was the fact that within a half-mile radius of the Cummings trailer, there were more than 40 registered sex offenders. That grim statistic turned the search into a minefield of potential suspects. And yet, even with all those names, one figure loomed largest in detectives' minds: Misty Croslin. Why? Because her story shifted like sand underfoot. First, the house was locked. Then suddenly it wasn't. First, Haleigh was in her pajamas, then in a Hannah Montana shirt. First, Misty woke to use the bathroom. Then she woke for water. Details about who slept were changed with each retelling. In cases of missing children, consistency matters, not just for truth, but for credibility. And Misty's credibility was crumbling fast. Investigators did something clever early on. They placed Ronald and Misty together in an interrogation room, left them alone, and let the cameras roll. What unfolded wasn't reassuring. Ronald grilled her, almost begging her to explain how she could have slept through everything. Misty looked stunned, but her silence and blank affect gave detectives little confidence. In the court of public opinion, perception is everything. And soon, this case leapt from local tragedy to national obsession. By February 10th, less than 24 hours after the 911 call, the FBI and Florida Department of Law Enforcement were on the ground, and over 200 officers were engaged in the search. TV crews swarmed Satsuma, reporters jostled for interviews, and anchors with national reach, Nancy Grace, Geraldo Rivera, turned Haleigh's disappearance into a nightly spectacle. Some families of missing children begged for publicity, But in this case, the spotlight revealed more than anyone expected. Ronald's criminal record surfaced. Drug charges, violent outbursts, even threats. Misty's troubled background was exposed. A dropout, a runaway, a teenager with a reputation for lying. And the community, once united in the search, split into camps. On one side was Ronald's family, defending Misty as a stand-in mother. On the other was Haleigh's biological mother, Crystal, convinced Misty knew far more than she admitted. What's striking here, and deeply sad, is how quickly the narrative became less about a missing child and more about adult dysfunction. Instead of a unified effort to bring Haleigh home, it devolved into blame, counterblame, and a kind of sideshow where every inconsistency became gossip fodder for TV ratings. And that, more than anything, shows us how fragile the line is between tragedy and spectacle in America's true crime culture. In the weeks after Haleigh vanished, the air in Satsuma was heavy, not just with grief, but with judgment. National media camped outside trailers, volunteers combed swamps, and neighbors whispered theories over fence lines. And then, just when it seemed the focus should be squarely on the missing 5-year-old, Ronald and Misty did something that left even seasoned observers stunned. They got married. Picture this, 1 month after the disappearance, with search parties still slogging through mud. Ronald pulled out his grandmother's diamond ring at a Chili's restaurant and asked Misty to marry him. She was 17. He was 25. The public reaction was immediate and furious. How? People asked, could any parent shift attention from a missing child to a backyard wedding? The timing alone was outrageous. The optics, worse. Some argued it was a desperate attempt to show unity, to cling to some semblance of family stability. But others saw it as grotesque, a teenage bride smiling for cameras while a little girl's face stared from missing posters. And here's the thing, perception matters. To grieving families, actions become symbols, and this marriage symbolized distraction, denial, and misplaced priorities. It didn't help that the marriage was met with resistance, even locally. The local church refused to host the ceremony, forcing them to settle for a backyard gathering. Ronald dismissed criticism, insisting that his personal life was no one's business, that the wedding was somehow what Haleigh would have wanted. But that defense only made people angrier. The national media seized on the contradictions. One moment Misty wept on TV, saying she wanted Haleigh found. The next, she was beaming in a white dress, smiling for tabloid cameras. The public didn't buy it. And to be honest, it felt almost surreal. If you step back, it reveals something deeply human. When people are under extreme stress, they sometimes make irrational decisions, clinging to rituals like marriage as if they could rewrite reality. But in doing so, Ronald and Misty handed skeptics ammunition. Critics asked, was this marriage about love or about shielding Misty legally and socially, as suspicion mounted against her? Was Ronald trying to protect her, or was he binding her to him so she couldn't turn against him later? These questions gnawed at public trust. Then came their appearance on national TV, most notably The Today Show. Viewers expected raw pleas for Haleigh's return. Instead, they saw defensive interviews, Misty fumbling through inconsistent retellings, Ronald snapping at hosts about why his personal choices shouldn't matter. The very platform that could have amplified the search only deepened doubts. And this is where media attention becomes a double-edged sword. On one hand, publicity keeps a missing child's name alive. On the other, it exposes every crack in the family story, magnifying inconsistencies into scandals. The result? The story of Haleigh's disappearance blurred into the story of Ronald and Misty's strange marriage. The original focus, a missing 5-year-old, slipping further into the background. From an analytical standpoint, this was a turning point. The case moved from a focused investigation to a circus where personal lives overshadowed evidence. And in true crime, that shift is dangerous. Because when the spotlight tilts toward drama, the victim risks being forgotten. As weeks turned into months, the frantic hope of finding Haleigh alive began to erode, replaced by suspicion and frustration. And the center of that storm was Misty Croslin. From the very beginning, her story had been shaky. But what investigators and the public would learn in the following months made it nearly impossible to believe anything she said. Ronald defended her fiercely, clinging to the idea that she was a stand-in mother to his children. But detectives saw something else. Inconsistency layered on inconsistency. And in investigations like this, inconsistent testimony doesn't just make someone look unreliable. It actively undermines every single lead. Misty had claimed both she and Ronald passed polygraphs, but the truth later emerged that she had actually failed 4 separate lie detector tests. Not 1, not 2, 4. She even failed a voice stress test, another method used to measure deception. And here's where it gets even more troubling. Instead of solidifying a single narrative, Misty's story kept evolving. At first, it was simply that she had been asleep. Then suddenly, she remembered details about doors propped open. Then she added descriptions of clothing that turned up in strange places around the trailer. And then the name of a new suspect appeared, her cousin, Joe Overstreet. According to Misty, Joe had a history of violence. And on the very day Haleigh was reported missing, he conveniently left Florida for Tennessee. Was this a coincidence, or was she pointing the finger to deflect suspicion? Her brother Tommy even claimed he saw Joe carry Haleigh out of the house in a black bag with a cinder block, destined for the river. It's the kind of detail that makes your blood run cold, vivid, specific, horrifying. But here's the analytical catch. The more outrageous the detail, the more investigators demand physical evidence. And when they dredged rivers, ponds, and swamps, they found nothing. Not a shoe, not a scrap of clothing, not a single trace. Which raises the critical question. Were these stories confessions wrapped in lies, or lies wrapped around grains of truth? From a psychological standpoint, when someone changes their story repeatedly under pressure, one of 2 things is usually true. Either they're lying to protect themselves, or they're so traumatized they cannot separate memory from invention. In Misty's case, her reputation, her background, and her drug use made the first explanation far more believable to the public. What complicated matters further was the community rumor mill. Whispers began to circulate that Haleigh hadn't been abducted at all, but had overdosed accidentally during a party, and that her body had been hidden. When police drained a pond called L Pond, convinced by a tip that this was her final resting place, they found nothing. But the mere existence of this theory revealed the depth of suspicion surrounding Misty and those in her orbit. And if we look critically at this, it becomes clear why law enforcement publicly shifted their stance. By August 2009, they abandoned the stranger abduction theory. They declared that Ronald and Crystal were not suspects, but Misty was the key figure in the case. This was a rare public statement, because usually police keep options open. But here, Haleigh had boxed her in so tightly that investigators felt comfortable naming her as central to the truth. And this, perhaps, is the saddest irony. If Misty was guilty, her lies delayed justice. If she was innocent, her lies still doomed her, because nobody could trust her. Either way, the one constant was that Haleigh remained missing, her story drowned out by contradictions. By late 2009, the case of missing 5-year-old Haleigh Cummings had stalled. Thousands of leads had gone nowhere. National attention was fading, and yet the families at the center of the storm weren't pulling closer in grief. They were unraveling. And as the investigation into Haleigh's disappearance grew colder, another truth became impossible to ignore. The adults in her world were sinking deeper into the chaos of drugs and violence. In August 2009, just months after the wedding spectacle, Ronald was arrested for burglary and assault following a fight triggered by Misty trying to leave him. The details were messy, but the symbolism was clear. The supposed united front that their marriage was meant to project was already collapsing. The very next day, Misty bailed him out, another cycle of dysfunction on repeat. Meanwhile, law enforcement had quietly shifted their stance, publicly naming Misty as the key to solving the case. They weren't calling her a suspect outright, but they made it clear her story didn't line up with the evidence in the home. And if you think about it, that's one of the most damning positions an investigator can take. By announcing it so directly, they were essentially saying to the public, "We know who's lying. We just can't prove the crime." That's a chilling limbo for any case to exist in. But instead of breaking under the weight of suspicion, Misty kept spiraling. She failed more polygraphs, dodged questions, added new details, and then, like so many people in unstable environments, she fell back into the familiar grip of drugs. By early 2010, the story took a grimly predictable turn. Undercover officers launched a sting operation targeting Ronald, Misty, her brother Tommy, and others in their circle. Over weeks, they documented 7 separate buys, seizing more than 300 prescription pills. It culminated in a massive bust. Both Ronald and Misty were arrested, this time not for what they might know about Haleigh, but for trafficking drugs. The image of them being led away in handcuffs was almost surreal. These weren't grieving guardians fighting for justice. They were criminals dealing in the very substances that had haunted their lives for years. For the public, this was the final straw. Whatever sympathy lingered evaporated. How could anyone believe they were dedicating themselves to finding Haleigh when they were orchestrating drug deals on the side? Misty was hit hardest, sentenced to 25 years in prison. Ronald received 15. Their choices had effectively slammed shut any chance of credibility, and with it, any remaining hope that they would ever come clean about the truth. What's so striking about this chapter is how it highlights the ripple effect of dysfunction. The disappearance of Haleigh was supposed to be the center of the story, but instead, the people around her became their own tabloid tragedies: addicts, fighters, liars, criminals. And in that chaos, the victim herself faded from the headlines. This happens more often than we like to admit in true crime. The narrative shifts from the lost child to the spectacle of the adults. The victim disappears twice, first physically, then symbolically in the storytelling. And that is perhaps one of the most devastating failures of all. By 2010, the headlines were no longer about Haleigh's disappearance. They were about drug trafficking charges, prison sentences, and mugshots of the very people who should have been fighting for her. Misty Croslin sentenced to 25 years, sat behind bars. Ronald, her ex-husband now, had 15 years to serve. But prison didn't silence Misty. If anything, it gave her a new stage. And with every interview, every rumor, the story of what happened to Haleigh twisted into something darker, something almost impossible to untangle. In 2012, while serving her sentence, Misty gave a televised prison interview. The cameras captured her recounting that February night yet again, cooking dinner, bathing the kids, putting them to bed. At first, it sounded rehearsed, a return to the responsible babysitter narrative she had leaned on before. But then came the cracks. She admitted she had tried calling Ronald 20 times that night, and he never answered. She claimed when he arrived home, he looked more messed up on drugs than distraught about his missing daughter. And then came another twist, a new story suggesting that Ronald owed money to drug dealers, and that Haleigh might have been taken as collateral. In Misty's telling, she overheard Ronald talking to a man outside a bar, a man who allegedly said, "The Mexicans have her, and that she would be returned if debts were paid." On the surface, it sounded cinematic, like something out of a crime drama. But under scrutiny, it crumbled. There was no evidence, no names, no corroboration. Just another story, one of many, that shifted responsibility away from her. And this is the maddening reality. Each new confession promised clarity, but delivered only more fog. From a psychological angle, this pattern is revealing. When someone trapped in lies faces years behind bars, the temptation to reshape their story grows. They hope that if they say just enough, someone might believe them, maybe even bargain for leniency. But what it does instead is erode trust further. Investigators, already convinced Misty knew more, now saw her as a fountain of half-truths. Too much to dismiss entirely, too unreliable to act upon. Among the theories that gained traction, one stood out with chilling plausibility: that Haleigh had accidentally overdosed on prescription drugs that were prevalent in the household, and that Misty, terrified of the consequences, concealed the truth. It's a theory investigators would later publicly endorse, even without proof. Think about it. The drug culture in that trailer wasn't speculation, it was fact. Ronald and Misty's later arrests confirmed it. The children lived in an environment where pills were currency, where substances flowed as freely as gossip. In that world, an accidental ingestion isn't far-fetched at all. The tragedy is that if this theory is true, Haleigh's death wasn't a calculated murder, but a preventable accident buried under fear and lies. And here's the harsh lesson. Sometimes the cover-up becomes more monstrous than the crime. A mistake could have been met with medical intervention, perhaps even forgiveness. But covering it up, dumping a body, spinning endless stories that ensured not just Haleigh's death, but the permanent staining of every name tied to her. As the years dragged on, the case of Haleigh Cummings slipped from national headlines, but the shadow it cast never disappeared. Misty Croslin remained behind bars, her 25-year sentence a grim monument to the chaos that defined her youth. Reports from prison described her as disruptive, caught with contraband, making threats, unable to stay out of trouble even while confined. Whatever innocence Ronald's family had once painted onto her image of a surrogate mother had long since collapsed. She was no longer the key witness. She was now the unreliable prisoner whose credibility had burned out completely. Ronald Cummings didn't fare much better. He served his time, but prison records tell their own story. Fights, contraband, drug use, weapons charges, a pattern that suggested he wasn't just unlucky, but unwilling to reform. He was released in October 2022 after serving roughly 85% of his sentence, but freedom didn't last. On Christmas Day that same year, he was found passed out in his car with a bottle of liquor in his lap, heavily intoxicated, and when police tried to remove him, he resisted violently, even attempting to grab an officer's gun. It wasn't just a relapse. It was a full collapse. His second chance at freedom ended with another arrest, another cell, and the realization that some people never escape their cycles of destruction. Meanwhile, Haleigh's mother, Crystal, tried to rebuild. She remarried, took back custody of Junior, and despite her own past arrests, she eventually slipped into quieter family life. For her, the tragedy never left, but survival meant creating a new normal, one where Haleigh's absence was a wound that never fully closed. And then there was Haleigh's great-grandmother Annette, the woman who had been the family's quiet anchor. She held on to hope until her final days, keeping gifts that strangers had sent for Haleigh, as if one day the little girl might return to open them. But Annette passed away from cancer without ever learning the truth. That's one of the most devastating details of this case. Hope can carry a person for years, but it cannot shield them from the ache of unanswered questions. By 2019, investigators laid their cards on the table. Their main theory, now public, was that Haleigh had died of an accidental overdose of prescription pills, her body dumped in the river. It wasn't a conclusion supported by hard evidence. No body, no confession, no physical proof. But it was the theory that fit the environment, the lies, and the downward spiral of every adult connected to her. Still, it was a theory, not justice. And in that gap lies the tragedy. A little girl's disappearance became a story about everyone except her. Ronald's rage, Mista's lies, Crystal's struggles, the media's circus, all these voices drowned out the one voice that mattered most, Haleigh's. And that is why, even now, this case lingers like an open wound. It's not just unsolved, it's unresolved. It forces us to confront how systems can fail children long before a headline declares them missing. It reminds us that bad decisions don't just ruin lives. They can erase them. And worst of all, it leaves us asking the same question year after year. How could a 5-year-old vanish from her own bed, surrounded by people, and never be found? More than a decade has passed since that February night in Satsuma, Florida, and yet the mystery of what happened to 5-year-old Haleigh Cummings remains unsolved. Her name lingers on lists of unsolved Amber Alerts, her face frozen in time on missing posters, a constant reminder of a little girl whose story was never allowed to be finished. But perhaps the most haunting part is that the case doesn't just highlight one terrible night. It exposes the slow-motion disaster that preceded it. From parents too young and unstable, to a justice system that prioritized steady paychecks over abuse allegations, to the presence of drugs and dysfunction in the home. Every warning sign was flashing long before Haleigh disappeared. And this is where the lesson lies. Tragedies like this don't emerge from nowhere. They grow in the cracks of neglect, secrecy, and poor choices until one day, the consequences spill out in the most devastating way. Theories still circulate: an overdose covered up, a violent argument gone too far, a family member's rage, or a party that ended in silence and shame. Each one might contain fragments of truth, but none bring Haleigh back. Misty still sits in prison, changing her story like changing masks. Ronald cycles through arrests, addictions, and lost chances. Crystal, though quieter, carries the weight of a mother's grief. And through it all, the little girl at the heart of the story remains voiceless, her fate unconfirmed, her absence a wound carved into everyone who once knew her. And here's the cruel irony. The longer a case drags on, the more it becomes about theories, suspects, and scandals, and the more the victim fades from view. But Haleigh cannot fade. She deserves more than whispers, more than rumors, more than being remembered as the child at the center of Florida's most terrifying case. She deserves justice, or at the very least, truth. For viewers watching this, the takeaway isn't just about one child in one small town. It's about vigilance. It's about recognizing the warning signs in families, the cycles of neglect and violence that put children at risk long before a tragedy makes headlines. It's about asking hard questions when things don't feel right, about refusing to accept silence where accountability is needed. Because the monsters in this story weren't strangers lurking in the dark. They were dysfunction, addiction, denial, and cowardice, forces that live much closer to home. And if Haleigh's short life teaches us anything, it's this. Protecting children means not waiting until it's too late. It means seeing danger even when it hides behind familiar faces. It means breaking cycles before they break lives. That is the lesson her story demands we carry forward.